She kept 12 orphans alive in a broken wagon. A cattle baron bought them a home. I'll tell you the exact moment I knew I wasn't the man I thought I was. It was a Tuesday in November, cold enough that my breath came out in rags. I was riding the south fence of my lower pasture, 23,000 acres, give or take, running from the rimrock down to the river bend when I saw the wagon. Not moving. Left rear wheel canted hard to the side, the axle sitting in the mud at an angle that told you it wasn't going anywhere without a new pin and half a day's work. Canvas cover ripped along the ridge seam, flapping in the wind. One of the mules was down, still in harness, neck stretched flat in the grass. The other stood with its head low, shaking. I pulled up 50 yards out, habit. You don't ride straight at something you don't understand. Then I heard them. Children more than one. The sound they make when they're past crying, when they've gone quiet and resigned and cold. That low, thin sound. I've only heard it a handful of times in my life, and each time it's put ice in my chest. I rode in. There were 12 of them. I counted twice because I didn't believe the first count. 12 children ranging from what looked like 3 years old up to maybe 14. All of them piled into that wagon under 2 quilts and a horse blanket that had seen better decades. Some of them were asleep or close to it. A few watched me the way animals watch things, still, measuring, ready to bolt if they could. And then there was her. She came around from the far side of the mule that was still standing, and she had a short-handled hatchet in her right hand and her jaw set like a woman who had made a decision some time ago about what she was and wasn't going to allow. Her coat was a man's coat, 3 sizes too large. Her boots were wrapped in feed sacking at the toes. There was dried blood on her left forearm, not fresh, crusted dark along a gash that had been bound with a strip torn from something. She looked at me, not at my horse, not at my rifle, at me. "That mule's dead," she said. "Broke its leg in a hole 2 miles back. I cut it loose and pushed the wagon here by hand. The wheel pin sheared. I've got 12 children, no food left since yesterday morning, and it's going to be below freezing tonight." She said it the way you'd read a ledger. "Here are the facts, here is what is." "You're on Cowboy land," I said. "I know whose land it is." That surprised me. I said, "You know me." "I know the brand," she said. "Everybody in 3 counties knows the Cowboy brand." She didn't say it like a compliment. She said it like a fact, same as the dead mule and the broken wheel. My name is Harlan Calloway. I was 58 years old that November. I had run the Calloway spread for 31 years, taken it over when my father died of a stroke leaning on a fence post and left me 40 head of cattle and a mortgage that should have swallowed me whole. It didn't. I worked. I bought and fought and froze and sweated and held on until the 40 became 400 became 4,000. And now I had 23,000 acres and nearly 800 head and a bunkhouse with 11 hired men, and a house with 9 rooms that I lived in alone. People knew the brand. They didn't particularly like me. I wasn't a cruel man, but I was a hard one, and I'd made hard decisions over the years that left some men's families worse off than they'd been, and those things don't wash out. You carry them. I knew what people said in Garnet when Harlan Calloway's name came up. I'd heard enough of it to know the rest. I looked at the 12 children. The oldest one, the boy of 14 or so, was watching me from the back of the wagon with his arms crossed over his chest, his chin at an angle that said, "Whatever you decide, mister, we've seen worse." He had a bruise along his jaw that was 3 or 4 days old, faded yellow at the edges. I looked back at her. "What's your name?" "Nora Fitch." "Where are you coming from, Mrs. Fitch?" "Miss," she said, "from Beaumont, from the Beaumont Children's Home which burned down 6 weeks ago. We've been moving since." 6 weeks. In a wagon with 12 children through the start of winter. I did the arithmetic without meaning to, and it came out to something I didn't want to think about too hard. "Where are you headed?" "Millhaven. There's a church there that said they'd take some of them." She paused just slightly. "Some." That word sat between us for a moment. Load what you can carry, I said. Leave the wagon. I'll send men back for it tomorrow. She didn't thank me. She just turned back to the wagon and started directing children, quiet and sure, each one by name. Get your coat, Jesse. Emmeline, take Marcus's hand. Samuel, you carry the small bag. She knew them all. Every name, every face, exactly where each one was without looking. I rode ahead to the gate and opened it. Held it while she walked them through. A string of children in the cold November light, one after another. The smallest one, a girl with a dirty face and one shoe, carried on the hip of the 14-year-old boy. I looked at that boy. He looked back at me. Neither of us said anything. I put them in the bunkhouse. My men were in from the day's work by then, and I told Denny, my foreman, what I needed the bunkhouse cleared out, all 11 men into the equipment barn for the night, cots brought from the main house, the stove stoked. Denny looked at me for exactly 1 second too long, and then he said, "Yes, sir," and went and did it without another word. He'd worked for me 15 years. He knew when I wasn't asking. I had a woman named Hattie who cooked for the hands. I found her in the kitchen and told her what we needed, and she put her hands on her hips and looked at me and then said, "How many children?" And when I told her 12, she closed her eyes briefly, opened them again, and turned to her stove and started adding wood to the firebox. That's a good woman, Hattie. Never wasted words on things that didn't need words. I brought food over myself, carried the first pot. It was a thing I didn't usually do. I didn't usually do much with my hands anymore, is the truth. I'd gotten to the point where other people did the doing and I did the deciding. But that night I carried the pot and I brought the bread and I set it on the table in the bunkhouse and watched those 12 children eat. Nora Fitch sat at the end of the table and made sure everyone else had their plate before she touched hers. The small girl with the one shoe, her name was Clee. I'd heard Nora use it 3 times, climbed into Nora's lap without asking, and Nora just shifted her arm to make room and kept serving. I stood near the door. I didn't know exactly why I was still there. "You can go," Nora said, not unkindly. She was looking down at Clee's hair, working a tangle loose with her fingers. "We're all right now." "I know you are," I said. I went back to my house, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while I thought about 6 weeks in a wagon with 12 orphan children and a dead mule in a muddy field on a cold Tuesday in November. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning I sent Denny and 2 men to retrieve the wagon. They came back with it at noon, and Denny found me in the barn and said the wheel was fixable, couple hours of work, and I said fix it. He said, and the mule, meaning did I want him to find a replacement from my stock. I said yes, a good one. Then I rode to Garnet. I had business there. I always had business there. But that morning I had a specific thing I wanted to do first, before the feed merchant and before the bank. I went to see Emmett Prout, who was the county assessor and also knew every piece of land and property within 50 miles that was for sale or recently sold or sitting empty. "What are you looking for?" Emmett said. "Something with a house on it, decent size, good water not too far out." Emmett pulled out his ledger. "How many acres?" "Enough for a garden and some animals, not range land, something smaller." He found his page and ran his finger down it and then looked up at me. "The Acafer place, 12 acres south of Garnet, about 4 miles. House has 4 rooms and a sleeping loft. Good well. The widow sold it in June to a fellow from Kansas City who never came to claim it, and now he's defaulted on the note. Bank's got it." "I know who's got it," I said. "The bank in Garnet was First Territorial, and I did enough business with them that Lloyd Marsh, the president, usually came to the door himself when he saw me coming. How much does the bank want for it?" Emmett told me it was fair, not cheap but fair. "All right," I said. Emmett looked at me. We'd known each other 20-some years. He said, "What are you doing, Harlan?" "Buying a piece of property." "I can see that. I mean, what are you doing? I didn't have a good answer for that yet, so I said, "None of your business, Emmett," and he laughed his short, dry laugh and wrote down the address. I went to the bank. Lloyd Marsh came to the door himself, as expected, and I told him what I wanted, and we sat down and worked it out inside of an hour. When I walked out, I had the deed to the Ackhafer place in my coat pocket and a receipt for the full amount paid. I rode home by way of the South Road, which took me past the property, pulled up and looked at it from the lane. It was a solid house. Rough, weathered, needed paint, one shutter hanging wrong on a hinge. But the walls were sound and the roof looked tight and the well had a good wooden cover and the barn was small but standing. There were 2 old apple trees in the yard, bare now, and a fence along the south side that a few hours of postwork would put right. I thought about 12 children, 4 rooms and a sleeping loft. It was tight, but children don't need much room. They need walls and a roof and a stove and somebody who's paying attention to them. She was paying attention, that much was plain. I rode back. When I got to the house, Nora was in my yard. She was standing at the well, washing something, one of the smaller children's shirts, by the look of it, working it against a washboard she'd found somewhere, her sleeves pushed up to the elbows. It was cold enough that her hands would be red. She'd built a small fire nearby to heat the rinse water. She'd done all of this without asking anyone, found what she needed and put it to use. I tied my horse and walked over. She looked up at me, didn't stop working. "Your men brought the wagon," she said. "Tell them I said thank you." "I'll tell them." She wrung out the shirt, hung it on the fence rail, reached into the bucket for the next thing. "Miss Fitch," I said, "I want to show you something. Will you ride with me?" She stopped, looked at me with a careful look, not suspicious exactly, but weighing. "The children." "The boy, Samuel, he can watch them for an hour." A pause. Then she dried her hands on her coat and said, "All right." We rode to the Ackhafer place without much talk. I'm not a talking man, and she didn't seem to require it. The horses went easy together and the road was quiet, and I noticed things about her as we rode. The way she sat a horse, easy and without fuss, like someone who'd done it all their life. The way she watched the land as we passed through it, taking account of it, the way a practical person does. When we reached the lane, I pulled up, and she pulled up beside me. She looked at the house, looked at the barn, the apple trees, the fence line. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Whose place is this?" "Mine," I said, "as of this morning." Another pause, longer. "Why are you showing it to me?" I reached into my coat pocket and took out the deed and held it out to her. She took it, unfolded it, read it, and she read slowly and carefully, line by line, the way someone reads something they want to be sure they understand before they respond to it. She looked up. "It's in my name," she said. "Yes." "Why?" I said, "Because 12 children need a roof, and you're the one who's been keeping them alive, so you ought to be the one holding the paper." She looked back down at the deed. Her jaw was working slightly, the way a jaw works when someone's keeping something behind their teeth. "I can't pay for this," she said. "I have $11.30 and a broken wagon." "I know. I'm not going to be beholden." "I'm not asking for anything back," I said. "Not a cent, not ever." She looked at me then, full on, the way she'd looked at me the first time, next to that dead mule, like she was trying to figure out what kind of man she was looking at. "Men like you don't give things away," she said. "It wasn't cruel, it was just honest." "Men like me usually don't," I said, "but here we are." She folded the deed along its creases, held it in both hands, looked at the house again. "It needs work," she said. "It does. The shutter's broken." "I'll fix it." She glanced at me sideways. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the near cousin of one. "You fix shutters." "I used to fix everything," I said, before I had men for it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The children will need to see it. They have opinions." "Bring them tomorrow," I said. "We'll walk the whole property." She nodded. Then she tucked the deed carefully inside her coat, next to her chest, and turned her horse back toward the road. We rode back in the same quiet we'd come in, but it was a different quiet, easier, the kind two people fall into when something's been settled between them that didn't need a speech. At the gate she stopped. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Harlan." A pause. "Harlan, why? The real reason, not the one you said." I looked at the fence post nearest me. An old one, the wood silver with weather, the wire stapled tight. "I looked at those children last night," I said, "eating at that table, and I tried to think of one good thing I'd done in 30 years with all this land and all this money, and I couldn't come up with much." She didn't say anything. "I'm not looking for credit," I said. "I'm not looking for anything. It was the right thing to do, and I had the means to do it, and there's no excuse for a man who has the means and doesn't act." She was quiet for a bit. The wind came through the fence and the brown grass bent. "That's the real reason," she said. "Yes." She looked at me for a moment more. Then she rode through the gate. The next day was clear and cold, and I took them all out to the Acafer place, all 12 children and Nora, in the wagon with the repaired wheel and the new mule. I drove, and Nora sat on the seat beside me with the small girl Clee in her lap. The children were quiet on the road, not unhappy quiet, watching quiet. They'd been moving for 6 weeks, and they didn't quite know yet when to stop bracing for the next hard thing. When we pulled up to the house, the 3 eldest boys jumped down before the wagon stopped. They ran the fence line, the way boys do, like they owned it already. The smaller children stood near the wagon until Nora said, "Go on, go look," and then they went. I walked the property with her. Showed her the well, the depth of it and how the pulleys worked, the cistern on the north side that would need cleaning before it could be used, the barn, which was small but tight, the root cellar, which was empty but dry. She didn't say much, just looked at everything, sometimes reached out and tested a board or checked a hinge with her thumb. In the house she walked each room slowly, opened the window latches to see if they sealed, knocked on the walls. In the sleeping loft she stood with her head near the rafters and looked up at the roof from inside and said, "It's tight, no light coming through." That was the best thing she could have said about it. The children found her in the loft. Clee first, then 2 others, then Samuel the 14-year-old last, climbing the ladder with his 2 long legs. He looked around the loft, looked at me. "How many can sleep up here?" he said. 6, comfortable. 8 if they're friendly," I said. He looked at me again. Then something happened in his face. The set of his jaw loosened just for a second, and he looked his age instead of older than it. "We're all friendly," he said, "by necessity." I thought that was one of the better things I'd heard in a while. We stayed the morning. My men had come ahead and laid fires in the 2 stoves, and the house was warm by the time Nora and the children walked through it. Hattie had sent food. She'd done it without being asked, just packed a box and sent it with the wagon. And at noon we ate in the kitchen, all 12 children and Nora and me, standing and sitting on the floor because there weren't enough chairs. After lunch I stood in the yard while the children ran the property again, louder now, more certain of it. Nora came and stood beside me. We watched the smallest ones run under the bare apple trees, arms out. "They'll be all right here," I said. "Yes," she said. I turned to leave. I had work, I always had work, and I'd given this morning and I didn't want to overstay. "Harlan." I stopped, turned back. She was looking at me the way she'd been looking at me since that first day, measuring, but different now. The measuring was done. She'd reached a verdict, and she wasn't hiding it. "Stay for supper," she said. "We don't have much, but we'll have enough." It was the plainest invitation I'd heard in my life. No decoration on it, no performance. "All right," I said. I came back that evening with a better excuse for the delay than I'd had. I told myself I was checking on the stove, on whether they had enough wood for the night. I brought wood, 2 full loads in the back of a wagon, my man Cal driving it. The truth is I just wanted to come back. That was all. I was 58 years old and I lived alone in a 9-room house, and I had money enough that no one could take anything from me. And somehow none of that had ever added up to much of anything that felt worth a damn at the end of a cold day. They'd made soup. I don't know where the vegetables came from. I found out later that 3 of the older children had walked to Garnet and bought them with some of the $11.30. It was a thin soup, honest about what it was, but it was hot and it was made, which is the best thing you can say about any food. I sat at the table with 12 children and ate soup and bread and listened to them. That's mostly what I did, listened. They talked more than I expected, asking about the land, about whether that was really a creek they'd seen to the north, about whether the apple trees would have apples come spring. Samuel asked me how many acres I ran. I told him. He did the arithmetic in his head and said, "That's a lot of fence." I said, "You have no idea." Nora was at the stove when she wasn't at the table, moving with that same quiet efficiency she'd had at my bunkhouse table, making sure everyone else was set before she sat. When she finally sat down, it was at the end, next to Clee, and the little girl immediately leaned into her side, and Nora's arm came around her without thought, just reflex. I watched that. After supper, the smaller children fell asleep in corners and on each other, and the older ones sat talking quietly in the next room while Nora and I cleared the table. We didn't speak much while we did it, just worked alongside each other. She washed, I dried. She handed me things and I put them where she pointed. Practical, like everything she did. When the dishes were done, she poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of me and sat down across the table. "I need to know something," she said. "All right. What do you expect from this? Not the property, from all of it." She nodded slightly at the room around us, meaning the house, the children, the supper, whatever the next thing after this was. I turned my cup in my hands. The coffee was strong. "Nothing," I said. "Nobody gives 12 acres and a house and expects nothing." "Maybe not usually," I said, "but I'm telling you honestly, I don't need anything from you. The children needed somewhere to land. You needed help landing them. I had the means. That's the whole ledger." She looked at me, took a drink of her coffee. "I don't know what to do with a man like you," she said. I thought about that. "You don't have to do anything with me," I said. "I'll fix the shutter. I'll make sure you have what you need to get through winter. After that, you'll be fine. You don't need me." She was quiet. Outside, the wind had come up and I could hear it working at the corner of the house. "What if I wanted to?" she said. I looked up. "What if I didn't want to not need you?" she said. Precise about it, the way she was precise about everything. "What if I thought a man who rides onto a woman's trouble on a cold Tuesday and never once makes her feel like she owes him, what if I thought that was worth something?" My hands were still on the cup. "You've known me 4 days," I said. "I've known enough men to know what I'm looking at," she said. "You don't get this old without knowing what matters." She wasn't soft about it. She wasn't making a speech. She was just sitting across the table from me in the kitchen of the house I'd bought her and saying a plain thing in a plain voice, and her eyes were steady and direct, and she wasn't looking anywhere else. I said, "I'm not an easy man to be around." "I can see that. People in Garnet don't think much of me." "I'm not from Garnet," she said. I set down the cup. "Nora." "Harlan." We sat there for a moment. The wind at the corner of the house and 12 sleeping children on the other side of the wall. "I'd want to come around," I said. "Not to manage things, just to come around." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I know." I did fix the shutter. 2 days later, with a new hinge pin from the hardware in Garnet and a hammer from my barn, standing on a ladder in the cold while Samuel Galt held it steady at the base. He was a serious boy, that one. Didn't talk much while we worked, just did what was needed and watched what I was doing with a focused attention that reminded me of myself at that age. When we were done and I climbed down, he looked up at the shutter. "Even," he said. "Has to be, otherwise it bangs." He nodded, considered, then, "You know carpentry." "Enough, my father was better at it." "Mine too," he said, and then he picked up the leftover hardware and walked back toward the house. I watched him go. A 14-year-old boy carrying orphaned children on his back all the way from Beaumont, and still paying attention to whether a shutter hung even. I thought, all right, this is something. I came around as I'd said I would. Not every day. I had a ranch to run and 11 men who needed managing and 800 head and a winter that was already showing its teeth by mid-November. But I came when I could. Sometimes it was work. I'd bring wood or come by to look at something that needed fixing, or bring Denny and one of the other hands to winterize the small barn. Sometimes it wasn't work. Sometimes I'd come in the afternoon and sit at the table while the older children did lessons. Nora taught them, every morning, reading and figures, and, for the eldest 3, some history, and I'd drink coffee and read the stock reports from the paper and be in the same room. Clee started sitting near me. Not on me, not demanding anything. Just near. She was 3, maybe 4, Nora didn't know exactly. She'd come to the home as an infant. She'd bring whatever she was playing with and sit on the floor close to my chair and do whatever she was doing in the particular focused silence of small children. I found I didn't mind. One evening in December, I came later than usual. Stayed for supper and then stayed after, not meaning to, and when the children went up to the loft, Nora and I sat by the stove and she mended things, always mending, she was. There was always something needing it with 12 children, and I watched the fire and we talked. Really talked that night. She told me about Beaumont, about how she'd come to work at the children's home at 21 and how she just kept on and never quite left. I said, why? She said because nobody else was going to, and the children needed somebody. I told her about the ranch, about my father and the 40 head and the mortgage. About the years of it, the bad winters and the years the market went sideways, and the one summer the grass burned off and I almost lost it all, and the way I'd had to sell some men's land cheap because they couldn't pay and I needed the capital. I told her that straight, the way it actually was, not trying to make it sound better than it was. She listened. She didn't flinch from the hard parts. She said, you did what you had to. I said, I know. That doesn't mean people don't carry it. She said, no, it doesn't. We sat there, the stove ticked. Is that why you live alone? She said. I thought about it, partly I stopped. It never seemed possible, I said, that kind of thing. I never seemed like a man a woman would want around long term. She looked at me over her mending. You're not easy, she said, but easy isn't what I'm looking for. I said, what are you looking for? She set down the mending. Steady, she said, honest, someone who shows up when it's hard and doesn't make a show of it. She paused. Someone who doesn't make me feel like I owe him. The stove ticked. The wind was up again outside. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held mine. We didn't say anything else for a while. Just sat there in the lamplight, the fire going, 12 children asleep above us, the cold outside pressing at the windows and the house holding against it. Christmas came. I hadn't celebrated Christmas in 12 or 13 years. It was just another day when you ran cattle alone, another day the hands got off and the house was quiet. But that year I found myself at the Ackeffer place on Christmas morning with a wagon loaded with things. A coat for each child in the right size because I'd had Hattie write down the sizes without telling me why she needed them. A sack of coffee and sugar and flour, 2 cured hams, a rocking chair I'd had made in garnet for Nora, nothing fancy, just solid oak and a good curved rocker, the kind that would last. When I pulled up, the children came out, and the older ones helped unload, and the younger ones milled around asking questions, and Samuel said, "You went to a lot of trouble." And I said, "Not really." And he gave me a look that said he knew better. Nora came out last. She saw the rocking chair and stopped, put her hand on the back of it where it stood in the yard, ran her fingers along the top rail. "Harlan," she said. "It's cold out here," I said. "Let's get it inside." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it was the first time I'd heard her laugh, and it was a good sound. She shook her head and turned to help me carry the chair, and we got it through the door and set it by the stove. That afternoon we sat in the warm house, and the children played outside in the cold, and from the window I watched them run, all 12 of them, the big ones chasing the small ones around the apple trees, their breath coming up in clouds. Nora sat in the new chair. She rocked it once, twice, testing the feel of it. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said. "I know. You've spent more than the property already. Food, wood, the repairs, now this." "I know," I said again. She looked at me, steady. "I'm going to make you a home-cooked meal every time you come," she said, "for the rest of however long this goes on. That's not enough, and I know it, but it's what I have." I said, "That's more than enough." She held my gaze. Then she said very quietly, "Don't be modest. You know what this is worth to them." She nodded toward the window, the children outside. "Don't be modest about that." I turned and looked at them. Running in the cold, calling to each other by name, 12 children who'd had 6 weeks in a broken wagon and now had a house and a stove and apple trees and each other. "Yeah," I said, "I know." There were complications with the children's status I hadn't thought about, legal complications. Nora explained them to me in January. The Beaumont Children's Home had been a private operation, not a state institution, and the fire that had taken it had also taken most of the records. The 12 children she had were technically not in anyone's official care. They were just with her. No paperwork, no formal transfer of custody, no legal standing. She told me this at the kitchen table one night, with a careful, controlled expression that told me she'd been worrying about it longer than she was letting on. "What happens if someone comes and says the children should be in county custody?" she said. I turned my coffee cup. "Who would come?" "I don't know. The county, eventually. Someone. If any of these children have family who have been looking." "Have they?" She looked at her hands. "No, not one. I checked every family I knew of before we left Beaumont. These 12, there's no one. That's why they were in the home in the first place." I looked at the table. "I know a lawyer in Garnet," I said. "Good one, we'll go see him." We went to see him. His name was Fike, Claude Fike, and he'd handled my land deals for 20 years. He listened carefully and asked his questions, and then said it was possible to establish formal legal guardianship for all 12 through the county court. He said with the right documentation, Nora's years of care, the provision of a stable home, the absence of any family claims, it was achievable. He said it would take some months and some paperwork. I said, "Start the paperwork." He said, "It'll cost." I said, "I know." Nora looked at me across Fike's desk, and I could see her doing the arithmetic of everything I'd spent, and I could see her wanting to say something about it and deciding not to. Later, on the walk back to where I'd tied the horses, she said, "You can't keep spending like this." "I can for a while longer," I said. "Harlan." "It's my money," I said. "I spent 30 years making it, and I never spent it on much of anything that mattered. Let me." She stopped walking. I stopped too and looked at her. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "No, you're not. You're 12 children who need a legal home and a woman who's been keeping them alive by sheer stubbornness. This is not charity. This is just," I looked for the word and found it, "this is just what needs doing." She looked at me for a long moment. The street was cold and quiet around us. Then she said, "You're an infuriating man." "I've been told that," I said. She turned and kept walking. I kept up. "Thank you," she said, ahead of me slightly, not looking back. "Don't mention it," I said. January and February were hard months. They always are in that country. The cold came in earnest and the snow stayed, and there were 2 weeks in February where the thermometer didn't get above 15 degrees and the creek froze to the bottom. I made sure they had wood. I made sure the food held. I sent Denny over twice a week to check on things when I couldn't come myself. Samuel and the 2 next oldest boys, Joel and Marcus, both 13, helped with the stock and learned fast. Good boys. Serious boys. The kind of boys that hardship makes, and who can go either way with it depending on who's around them. Denny told me in February at the end of one of his rides, "That woman is something, Harlan." I said, "I know. She had those boys up at first light chopping wood before it got below zero. Had them organized like a small army. Didn't holler or fuss, just told them what needed doing and why, and they did it." "She's been doing that for 6 weeks in a broken wagon," I said. "She's good at it." Denny nodded, turned his hat in his hands. "You going to marry her?" he said. I said, "Denny, just asking. Mind your business." He put his hat back on and went to see to his horse, and I could hear him chuckling as he went. The thought wasn't new. I've been thinking it since December, or maybe since before that, maybe since that first evening in my bunkhouse when I watched her make room for Clee in her lap without looking, without thinking about it, just reflex. A woman who took in 12 orphan children and walked them through winter on $11.30 doesn't do that because she was told to. She does it because she can't do otherwise, because it's what she is. I'd spent 31 years being what I was, too, hard and alone and making difficult choices and turning the Callaway land into something, and I'd always thought that was enough. That what you built was enough. That being capable and steady was its own reward. But there's a difference between being capable alone and being capable alongside someone who sees it for what it is. She saw it. That was the thing. She looked at me, not at the 23,000 acres, not at the Callaway brand, not at the ledger, and she saw the man who fixed the shutter and brought wood in the cold and sat at the table with her children and didn't ask for anything back. She saw that man and she decided he was worth something. I hadn't known, until someone saw me that way, how much I'd wanted it. In March the snow started pulling back and the land went brown and wet, and the creek thawed and ran loud with it. I came on a Saturday morning in mid-March and found Nora in the yard with 3 of the children, turning the kitchen garden. The ground was barely soft enough, but she was working it with a spade, and the children were pulling out the old dead stalks from whatever had grown there in summers past. I tied my horse and went to her. She was breathing hard from the work, her hair pinned up but coming loose at the sides, dirt on her forearms. She looked up when she heard me. "Early for that," I said. "The ground's been workable for 3 days. She handed me the spade. "Show me where to dig deep." I took the spade and went to the near corner of the bed and put my boot on the shoulder and drove it in. Good dark earth, dense with the cold coming out of it. I worked it up. She came and crouched down and took a handful and crumbled it between her fingers, checking the texture. "Another week," she said. "Probably." She straightened, looked at me the way she did sometimes, like she'd been thinking about something and had come to a conclusion. "Come in," she said. "I want to talk." The older children were out. It was just Clee, asleep in the corner with a rag doll she'd been given at Christmas, and the 2 of us at the table with coffee. Nora turned her cup in her hands. "I need to tell you something," she said. I waited. "I've thought about this a long time," she said. "Since before Christmas, if I'm honest, and I've been waiting to see if it would change, if what I thought about you would change." "Has it?" "No," she said. "It's only gotten more certain." I looked at her across the table. "I am not a woman who asks for things," she said. "I've never been. I ask for what the children need and that's all. But I want to ask you something now, for myself, and I need you to let me say it plainly." Say it, I said. I want you to be here, she said. Not coming and going, not checking in here. In whatever way that means, you tell me how it looks on your end, but I want you in this house, at this table, with these children for good. She paused, and for the first time I saw something that might have been nervousness cross her face. I want you to be the man they wake up to. The one who's there when something breaks and when something's good. I want. She stopped, steadied herself. I want you to stay, she said, if you're willing. I looked at her for a moment. Then I reached across the table and put my hand on hers, the same as I'd done in December, and she turned her hand over again and held mine. I've been looking for a reason to stay since November, I said. You're not the first one to ask. You're just the first one I wanted to say yes to. She held my hand. Her grip was firm, she didn't look away. The 9-room house, she said, stays mine, but I'm not going to be in it much. The children are my concern too, if you'll let them be. She let out a slow breath. Something in her shoulders released that I hadn't known was held. Samuel's going to test you, she said. He tests everyone. I know, he already has been. He's been deciding about me since that first night. And I think he's mostly decided. He'll come around the rest of the way when he's ready. A quiet, Clee shifted in the corner, muttered something in her sleep. It won't be easy, Nora said. I don't do easy, I said. I do steady, long-term that I can do. She looked at me, full on. The measuring look, but warm now. The measuring had been done months ago, and what was left was just her looking at me the way a woman looks at a man she's already chosen, openly, without anything held back. I know, she said. That's why I'm asking. Before I gave her an answer that night in March, I did one thing. I rode back to the Calloway place, my house, the 9-room one, and I walked through it in the dark with a lamp, room by room, not looking for anything, just doing it deliberately. It was a fine house. I'd built it in stages over 20 years, and I'd built it solid because I don't do things halfway. Good floors, tight windows. A kitchen that a woman had told me once, in a different time, was the nicest kitchen she'd seen west of St. Louis. I didn't know if that was true. I'd been alone in it so long it had stopped being a house and become just a place where I slept and left my boots. I stood in the front room and held the lamp up and looked at it. Then I set the lamp down on the table, took off my coat, sat in the chair where I usually sat when I read the paper, and I thought about it, about what she'd said, about staying, about what it meant to do the thing you've avoided for 30 years because you told yourself you were the kind of man who didn't need it. You don't always know what you need. That's the plain truth of it. You think you've made your peace with what you've built and what you are, and then a woman asks you to stay, plainly, without decoration, because she's decided you're worth it, and you realize the peace you'd made was just the patience of a man who'd given up on the other thing. I didn't want to give up on the other thing anymore. I rode back, told her, yes, you already know that part. We married in April. Not a big thing. Emmett Prout stood up as witness, and Hattie, and the children all scrubbed and in their best, which for some of them wasn't much but was what they had. The minister from the church in Garnet came out to the house. We stood in the kitchen because the yard was muddy and the kitchen was warm. Clee sat on my hip throughout the whole thing, apparently having decided some weeks earlier that this was her preferred position whenever I was in the room. Samuel stood at the back. He watched the whole ceremony with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and when it was done he came over and put his hand out. To me, not to Nora, to me. I shook it. You're square with me, he said, formal about it like a man. I said good. He nodded once and went back to the others. Nora was standing at my shoulder. I could feel her there. When I turned, she was looking at Samuel across the room, and her face was doing several things at once, proud and moved and trying not to show it, the way she did. I put my hand on the small of her back. She leaned into it just slightly. I moved between the two houses as needed, Someone had to keep the Callaway land running, and I had men to manage and cattle to tend, and the business of the ranch that didn't stop, because a man had remarried at 58. But my evenings were at the Acafer place, our place now, Nora's and mine and the children's, and most mornings too if I could manage it. The children settled into it, took it the way children take things that are just suddenly there as normal as given as the way it is. Clee took to calling me Harlan at first, the way Nora called me, and then in early summer without explanation switched to something else, a word of her own. I won't repeat it, that's between her and me. Samuel was the last one to let his shoulders down around me. It took until June, a Saturday when we were repairing the section of fence along the north edge of the property that the winter frost had heaved. We'd been working since morning, setting posts, stretching wire. Hard work. Neither of us had said much. Then he said out of nowhere, "My father was a stockman." I handed him the wire stretcher. "In Texas. Louisiana, he died when I was 6. He set the hook and began cranking. I don't remember much about him." I held the post while he worked. The wire tightened. "Do you want me to tell you things about cattle?" I said. "Or about being a stockman, if you want to know?" He looked at me sideways from behind the stretcher. Something moved through his expression. "Yeah," he said, "I do." That was June. By the time August came and the apples were on the trees, not many that first year, but some, a few dozen in the lower branches. He was following me around the Callaway spread on weekends with the focused attention he'd had from the beginning, watching everything, asking questions that were good questions, the kind that come from someone who thinks before they speak. The summer had a rhythm to it I hadn't expected. Work, and then the evening, and then the porch. Weekdays I was mostly at the Callaway land, checking the cattle, managing the men, doing the business of a ranch that didn't run itself. But I was home. It had become home without my particularly deciding it by supper time most nights, sometimes earlier. The children fit into the days and the way children do. The older ones had chores and did them mostly, with the usual resistance and the usual eventual capitulation. The younger ones ran the yard and explored the creek and came inside wet and cold, and were sent out again warmer and went back to the creek. Clee became a particular shadow of mine on the weekends, not demanding attention, just present, carrying her rag doll, appearing at my elbow while I worked on something and watching with the earnest concentration of someone who intends to understand what they're looking at. One afternoon she brought me a broken hinge she'd found somewhere, held it up to me. I took it and looked at it and said, "Where'd you get this?" She pointed vaguely at the barn and said something that might have been in there. I said, "Yeah, it's broken, want to fix it." She said, with the solemnity of a child who is rarely asked such things, "Yes." So we sat in the yard and I showed her how the pin worked and where the break was, and then I went to my tools and got what I needed and fixed it while she sat beside me and watched each step. When I had it fitted back together and working, I showed her how it swung. She swung it herself 3 times, testing it. Then she said, "Good," and went back to her doll. I sat there for a moment in the sun with a fixed hinge in my hand. That's all. Just a fixed hinge and a small girl who'd gone back to her business. I can't tell you exactly what it was, but it settled something in me that I hadn't known was unsettled. One afternoon in September, I told him I was thinking about fencing off a new section of the lower pasture for winter grazing, and I wanted him to ride with me and see if I was thinking about it right. He said, "You want my opinion? You've got better eyes for the grass than Denny does. Don't tell him I said that." He sat up straight on his horse and I could see him trying not to show it. "All right," he said. We rode it together and he told me what he thought, and most of what he thought was right. When we got back I said so, and he said, "I figured the runoff goes northeast from that rise. You have to account for it." And I said, "That's exactly what you have to do." The guardianship papers came through in August. Fike sent word and Nora, and I rode into Garnet to sign them. 12 names on 12 separate documents, each one witnessed and stamped and official. It took most of the morning. When we walked out of the county clerk's office, she had the papers in a cloth folder pressed against her chest, both arms crossed over them. We stood on the board sidewalk in the summer heat. "They're ours," she said, quietly, not to me particularly, just out loud. "Yes," I said. She stood there for a moment. Her chin dropped a little. Then she straightened and said, "All right, we should get back and walk to the horses." I watched her go. A woman who had carried 12 children through winter and never once let them see her uncertainty, and now standing on a sidewalk with legal papers pressed to her chest, taking a breath. I thought, this is what it looks like when something that mattered is finally safe. I went and got my horse and we rode home. Nora sat on her porch in the evenings in the rocking chair. Come fall, she'd taken to sitting there after the children were down, sometimes with mending, sometimes without, just in the quiet with a cup of coffee. I'd come and sit on the step below her, and we'd watch the dark come in. One night in late September, the air just starting to bite again, the first hints of what was coming, she put her hand on my shoulder. Just that, her hand resting there. I put my hand over it. The stars were coming out. The horses were quiet in the small barn. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked once and stopped. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "Nothing much," I said. "This." She was quiet for a moment. The chair rocked. "It's a good this," she said. "Yeah," I said, "it is." She kept her hand on my shoulder and I kept mine over it, and the night came in around us, cold and clear, and the apple trees stood dark at the edge of the yard, and inside the house 12 children slept. I thought, this is what a life is. Not the 23,000 acres, not the 800 head or the 11 hired men or the 9-room house. This, a porch in September, a good woman's hand on my shoulder, 12 children who had a roof and a stove and someone to wake up to. I thought, I didn't know I was missing it until I found it. And then I stopped thinking and just sat in it, in the dark, in the quiet, in the good particular weight of her hand.